For years, he was the most wanted man on the planet, a name that crossed borders, languages, and triggered the same reaction everywhere: immediate tension. Osama bin Laden was not just the leader of an organization. He became the face of a new kind of conflict. Decentralized, unpredictable, and extremely difficult to fight. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States entered a new era. This was no longer a traditional war, with clear borders and defined armies. It was a war against networks, against invisible cells, against an enemy that didn't need territory to exist. The American response was immediate. The invasion of Afghanistan aimed to dismantle the structure of Al-Qaeda and capture its leader. But despite the initial pressure, bin Laden disappeared. And this disappearance was not accidental. He had spent years preparing for it, avoiding technology, avoiding patterns, avoiding anything that could be traced. He understood, before many others, that the greatest strength of the United States was not only military, it was informational. And that was exactly what he tried to neutralize. In the years that followed, the Central Intelligence Agency launched one of the most extensive intelligence operations in modern history. But this search did not look like the movies. There were no clear clues, no exact locations, no quick answers. There were fragments, interrogations conducted around the world, incomplete financial records, intercepted conversations, often without context. Every piece of information was analyzed, classified, reevaluated, and often discarded. But even discarded fragments were preserved. Because in intelligence, nothing is ever truly useless. And that is how, slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Not about bin Laden directly, but about someone close to him. A courier, someone who rarely appeared, but appeared just enough. His name surfaced across multiple interrogations, years apart, always indirectly, always cautiously, which, paradoxically, made it even more important. Because when a name appears repeatedly, in different contexts, it is rarely a coincidence. From that moment on, the strategy changed. It was no longer about finding bin Laden. It was about finding the man who carried messages to him. And that was a fundamental shift. Because a leader can hide, but a network must move, and movement leaves traces, even small ones, even rare ones. Over time, the identity of this courier became clearer. Aliases were connected to real names, or to possible locations, and eventually, to movement patterns. This process took time, a lot of time, and at many points, it seemed to lead nowhere. But intelligence does not move in straight lines. It advances, retreats, and advances again, until finally, a breakthrough occurred. A vehicle was identified. A pattern of movement observed. And from that, a location began to take shape. A house, but not just any house. An unusual compound in Abbottabad, in Pakistan. At first glance, it seemed like an unlikely place to hide someone so wanted. But that was exactly what made it so intriguing. Because sometimes the best place to hide is where no one expects to look. The compound stood out for several reasons. High walls, reinforced barriers, limited but strategically placed security features, no connection to conventional communication networks, no phone lines, no internet. Trash was not collected, it was burned. And to intelligence analysts, that was a clear signal. Someone there was trying not to be found, but disappearing completely is almost impossible, because living creates patterns, even when you try to avoid them. For months, the compound was monitored. Satellites captured images. Analysts observed routines. Movements were recorded. And then, a figure appeared. A man who never left the compound. Never clearly seen, but consistently present. He walked within the courtyard. Always inside, never outside. This man became known as the Pacer. And for some analysts, that was enough. A strong indicator, but still not proof. And that was the problem. Because making a decision based on assumptions could lead to irreversible consequences. The intelligence reached the highest level of government. President Barack Obama was briefed, and at that moment, a series of intense discussions began. Members of the National Security Council participated, military leaders, intelligence officials, each bringing a different perspective. There were doubts, many doubts. What was the level of certainty? What if they were wrong? What if the target wasn't there? What if the operation failed? These were not just technical questions. They were political, strategic, global, because any mistake would have worldwide consequences. Three main options were considered: an airstrike, a joint operation with Pakistani forces, or a direct raid conducted solely by U.S. forces. Each had advantages and risks. An airstrike would eliminate the target quickly, but destroy evidence and risk civilian casualties. A joint operation could reduce diplomatic tension, but increase the risk of leaks. And a direct raid was the most precise, but also the most dangerous, because it involved entering foreign territory without formal authorization. The decision required more than analysis. It required judgment. And eventually, a choice was made. A direct operation would be carried out, and not by just any unit, but by a highly specialized team from the United States Navy SEALs, a unit trained specifically for high-risk missions. The operation was given a name, Operation Neptune Spear, and the planning phase began with extreme precision. Replicas of the compound were built, rehearsals conducted repeatedly. Every entry point, every movement, every possible scenario, everything was simulated. Because in this kind of mission, there is no improvisation without preparation. On the night of the operation, helicopters crossed the border, flying low, avoiding radar, silent. Time was critical. Surprise, essential. As they approached the target, something went wrong. One of the helicopters lost stability during insertion, a high-risk moment. But the team had trained for failure and reacted instantly. The helicopter was abandoned. The mission continued. Without hesitation, they entered the compound and moved forward, room by room, floor by floor, every second, filled with tension. Inside, there was resistance, but the advance continued, up to the top level, and then the decisive moment. The target was identified and neutralized. It all happened in minutes, fast, direct, precise. But even then, the operation was not over. Materials were collected: computers, documents, storage devices, information that could reveal networks, plans, connections, and then extraction. The damaged helicopter was destroyed on site to prevent sensitive technology from being captured, and the team exited Pakistani airspace without announcement, without confirmation. Hours later, the world changed. The president addressed the nation, a short message, but historic. Osama bin Laden was dead. The reaction was immediate. In the United States, people gathered in the streets. Celebrations, but also reflection, because that moment marked the end of a long pursuit, but not the end of the conflict. The death of bin Laden had strategic impact, but also symbolic weight. It showed that persistence mattered. That even after years, the objective remained, but it also raised questions about sovereignty, about methods, about the future of warfare, because Al-Qaeda was not built around a single individual. It was a network, and networks adapt. Still, the impact was undeniable, and perhaps the most important part of this story is not the raid itself, but everything that led up to it. Years of analysis, years of uncertainty, years of difficult decisions, because in the end, this was not just a military operation. It was the result of a long, complex process, a combination of intelligence, strategy, and execution, and that combination is what made the difference, because finding someone who does not want to be found is not about force alone. It is about understanding patterns, recognizing what is not obvious, and above all, having patience. And when that patience finally meets opportunity, action happens, fast, precise, decisive, and that is exactly what happened that night, a moment that began years earlier and ended in minutes, but whose consequences are still being discussed today.